Okay, ladies and gents, welcome to the first episode of Ding and the Quiz is Done. Obviously, as this is our first episode, things may change over time, but we'll see how it goes. So, as per popular request, we're going to begin with our Today in History for the 21st of March, and that is the anniversary of the closing of Alcatraz Prison, San Francisco. It closed in 1963 after 110 years as operating as a prison, and although 36 people attempted to escape while it was operating as a prison, none of them managed it. It's possible that 2 did after jumping into the river, but it's highly likely that they drowned. Right, so today we're only going to cover feedback on the exam drill that you gave me on Friday. Normally you would have your exam drill in front of you, but for today we're just going to have a look at some general feedback and then I'm going to ask you to attempt the question again. So you need something to write with, either lined paper or your exercise book, and you need a green pen. Okay, so that's the question that we were given. Explain 2 ways in which the Black Death in the Middle Ages and cholera epidemics in the 19th century were similar. We have some real strengths here. On almost every answer I saw examples of planning. Everyone included examples for at least one of the epidemics, and generally our points are becoming a lot more nuanced and a lot more specific. The HTIs I'm going to break down into knowledge, skill and structure, and then we'll have a look at a couple of SPAG errors as well. So, in terms of knowledge, first of all, a couple of us are still saying that Galenic medicine was supernatural. Now, I'm aware of the fact that Galenic medicine was supported by the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, but that doesn't mean that they believed it was supernatural. Supernatural means anything which is beyond explanation or beyond nature, and Galen specifically said that the 4 humours could be explained. So we shouldn't be calling the 4 humours supernatural. Second thing, some people were talking about cholera outbreaks in the 19th century as though they only occurred in 1854. Now, 1854 was a major outbreak, and obviously we can use it as evidence of people beginning to understand disease a lot more, but it doesn't mean that it was the only outbreak of cholera, and in fact outbreaks of cholera had been occurring in the 19th century right from the beginning of that century until the end, although obviously there were a lot fewer of them. 2 at once apparently. Next one then is support for Snow. So a couple of people said that nobody believed John Snow when he presented his evidence in 1854, and although people generally didn't accept germ theory until the 1860s, Snow did present convincing evidence, and the fact that the government were willing to remove the handle of the Broad Street pump tells us that at least some people supported his argument and his evidence that cholera was spread by water, not by miasma. Next thing, when we are talking about government's attitudes to public health, we should only be using laissez-faire to talk about the 19th century. It was a concept that only really appeared in the 19th century and onwards. If we're talking about the Black Death or earlier in the 19th century, we can talk about governments being unwilling to improve public health or finding it very difficult to improve public health, but they weren't necessarily laissez-faire. A couple of other people have got a little bit confused about the relationship between miasma and spontaneous generation. So miasma is the belief that the disease is caused by bad smells. Spontaneous generation is essentially an explanation for why there are germs there. They do connect up in that the bad smell causes the disease, and then the bacteria or the germs are the result of that disease, but I wouldn't discuss them together unless you're really, really confident about the fact that it's not really a causal link. Okay, in terms of skill and structure, one thing that we have to make sure that we do is include examples from both periods in each of our paragraphs. I don't know whether this was a timing issue or people simply forgot, or it was a lack of in-depth planning, but a lot of people were giving a point, giving me an example from one period, and then moving on to the next paragraph. So something that we saw done really, really well when we looked at our 16 markers was that planning as we went along. That might be a good plan to do on the side of your comparison questions to remind you to include an example from both periods. A lot of people wrote me paragraphs about the impact of these 2 epidemics, arguing that they both resulted in significant improvements to public health. I can understand your point, but I think it's a fairly weak paragraph to write about, particularly as the improvements to public health after the Black Death weren't necessarily the result of specific government action, and because Specifically if we're talking about the 1854 cholera outbreak, that did result in the 1848. No, it didn't. It didn't result in the 1848 Public Health Act, but it did demonstrate actually that improvements being made to public health were not enough. And then, in terms of our SPAG errors, a lot of people were spelling epidemic EPE rather than EPI, so we just need to check for that. It and they are starting to creep in again, which, unless you've made it absolutely crystal clear what you're talking about, is going to make your writing seem really vague and make it sound like you don't know what you're on about. And finally, some people were using abbreviations in their answers. It's not okay to refer to the Black Death as BD and cholera epidemics as CE. These are not abbreviations that are commonly used, and people will not know what you're writing about unless you're clear. Okay, so let's have a quick look then at a really strong example and pick it apart. Let's see if I can get this to work. Look at that, wonderful. Right, we've got the bell, we've got the mug of cola, we have the example answer. So, one way that the Black Death and the 19th century cholera outbreaks were similar is that they were either caused or exacerbated by poor public health conditions in their respective times. You can see in a previous take I got a little bit ahead of myself and already started annotating the answer. Really nice use of exacerbated there. That specific, accurate vocabulary allows this student to say a lot in a short space of time. The Broad Street cholera outbreak in 1854 was caused by the poorly maintained and therefore contaminated water supplies in London. The Black Death was able to spread quickly due to the unclean streets that provided an ideal habitat for the rats carrying the bacteria to thrive. Both epidemics highlighted the necessity for changes to public health conditions in their time. So we've got that overall principle here, and then that principle has then been proved with one example from the 19th century and then one example from the Middle Ages. Now, in order to make this paragraph even stronger, I would suggest two things. First thing, when discussing the 1854 cholera outbreak, making it clear that that's one example of one outbreak of cholera within the 19th century and that there were multiple outbreaks during this period. And second thing, I would be a little bit careful about the phrasing of this final sentence. I can definitely see the point. However, I think this idea of like the necessity for changes to be made suggests that the government had a really, really key role in improving public health in urban areas in the Middle Ages, and arguably improvements to public health weren't really as a result of government after the Black Death. But this overall structure of nuanced, specific point, which is then proven by bits of evidence from both periods, and we can see up here evidence of planning, is exactly what we should be looking for. Okay, so what you now need to do is go back to this feedback, have a look at your answer, if you've got access to it, if you took a photo. If you don't, you're just going to have to redraft and then redraft your answer. You are more than welcome to email it to me. However, please don't expect personalised feedback, otherwise I'm going to be caught in this constant loop of emails of single pieces of work. Okay, final thing then. If I can get this to work, bear with me for 1 second. There we go. If you want to take this a little bit further, and I am going to try and do this on each one of these episodes, then we have 4 things for you to do. If you found this question quite difficult, then we have a couple of sections of your knowledge organiser and quiz booklet to test from. If you want to take things a little bit further in terms of your knowledge, I've linked you to an article you can read, a series of clips that you can watch. An extra history is generally really good. And if you want to do a little bit further practice, here is a different style of exam question that you can do, and please feel free to either email me if you have me for history, or to email your history teacher. Okay, thank you very much. I'll see you later on.